Yeah, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Let me start by saying that both as a Croat and as an academic, it's always so lovely to be back here in Dubrovnik. I am at the Norwegian University, but I'm Croat originally, who moved for various reasons outside of Croatia and always loves to come back here. It's also a very special honor to give talk here at this memorial conference for Katie. I think that first time I heard of Katie was a couple of years ago. It was Professor Dunja Jutronic that Anita was mentioning earlier, that was talking about the conference that you guys had and her contribution. But she made me aware of Katie and of Katie's contributions beyond academia and academics, but also to the geographical parts of this area. So for all I know, it might be Dunja that is also responsible that I'm here today. Okay, on to today's talk. Well, it's connected to research on AI that I will be doing as part of this Norwegian Research Council project on the trustworthy AI. What I'm presenting today is pretty much work in progress, where I'm very open to all kinds of suggestions. And I will be presenting on the topic of large language models and strong plausible deniability. What is plausibly undeniable is that AI has made us to think and rethink a lot of our concepts be tailored, particularly for humans. So the plan here is today to draw attention to one phenomenon within linguistics and philosophy of language. It's the phenomenon of linguistic plausible deniability, and try to see how LLMs, if at all, score on various accounts that we have for the human linguistic plausible deniability. This talk is a combo of 3 papers. I know that's a bad idea always, and it's very late. I'll try to run through the conference paper, perhaps not as smoothly as Andy managed to go. I have a relatively, not that many slides, but enough that I might need to skip some parts. But we can always get back to that in Q&A. I have some linguistic, epistemic, and perhaps moral lessons that I want to talk about that connect human language and LLMs with plausible. Okay, I think it's enough of the intro. Here's the plan for me. The main research question, if you want, here is, are there any prospects for a unified account of language plausible deniability across human language and LLMs? So I'll first distinguish between plausible deniability as a phenomenon in general, and then I'll introduce LPD or language plausible deniability as a subspecies of plausible deniability. Then I'll talk a bit about human language with plausible deniability, and I will compare 2 theses: the epistemic thesis that's been around for some time, and the strong linguistic thesis that I am trying to introduce. The poetry is the bridge, and this is the most sketchy part of the talk, I believe. So I'm very open to pick the nucleus on that part of where I try to come with some relatively minimalistic assumptions about LLMs, and in order to make the bridge from human language to LLMs. Part 4, I will then move from human language with plausible deniability to LLMs with plausible deniability, and then I will evaluate these 2 theses that we have in human language, and we'll try to tell something which one scores best with respect to extending linguistic plausible deniability to LLMs as well. Well, the short answer is if the strong linguistic thesis that I introduced in number 2, I believe it scores better than the current human language with plausible deniability thesis does. I will skip part 5, but happy to talk about whether it's possible to, or whether we should restrict some language with plausible deniability that LLM spits out. And I'll hopefully have some time to just kind of give some quick lessons. Okay, then let's start on the first part, plausible deniability versus LTD. Okay, term plausible mobility is the term that most likely you've heard in your life, and most likely you've heard it in a different context, a bit of slightly different context that I will be talking today. It's the one that originated in the Cold War era, the term itself. I mean, the phenomenon has been around for a while. But usually it's a general phenomenon, so not necessarily linguistic or non-linguistic. When we talk about plausible mobility, we say that it refers to a person's ability to credibly deny responsibility or knowledge or involvement in an action, either linguistic or non-linguistic action. Here I'll be particularly interested in plausibly denying linguistic action, because there is no evidence, and now here's the question, what kind of evidence, linguistic or non-linguistic evidence, directly trying to tying the speaker, in our case, to the linguistic action that perhaps was not good or risky. Plausible mobility is a general phenomenon, both linguistic and non-linguistic. It's used all across the board, everyday language, but also there are some specialized people working on plausible mobility, creating plausible mobility in areas such as law, military, programming, cryptography, religion, computer science, you name. I'm using the wrong computer. I should do this. Perhaps also look more this for the sake of our Zoom participants. So just to give you a gist or a hint, when thinking of espionage, so when you have spies that often work with layers of separation from their handlers, so if they are caught, they are government or those who are handling them, then they cannot deny any connection to activities. This is not linguistic per se, or non-linguistic. It depends how these layers of separation are done, but it often involves both things. What I want to look at is the subspecies, if you may, of plausible mobilities when we have a speaker conveying or asserting, if that's how you want to put it, a certain message or a proposition that she could, if the speaker is then challenged by the audience, plausibly deny and claim that the message or the proposition she conveyed or asserted is in fact some other and often non-risky message. I'll get to the example in a sec. Here's our example, a classical example that's been given by Pinker and then Lee and Pinker and some of us trying to kind of drag it a bit further and modernize it. It's basically an example where you have a driver, let's say that's you, trying to bribe a police officer after running a red light. You can engage in at least two types of bribery. One bribery that can be implicit bribery. You could ask the police officer if you can take care of the ticket on the spot. Or you can try to bribe more explicitly and say, I'll give you money if you let me go without a ticket. So what allows the first case, when you say, can you take care of the ticket on the spot, to be a successful example of implicit bribery, is its potential for plausible mobility. So if then I say, can we take care of this on the spot? If the police officer is not cannot be corrupted, they will challenge you as an audience and they will say, why are you trying to bribe me, right? What is the cool thing, if it is, thing about plausible mobility is that you have a move you can make, a conversational move you can make. You as a driver then can deny that by uttering, can we take care of the ticket on the spot, that you intended to assert a certain proposition P, where P, for example, is let me give you the money instead of paying the fine. And instead said, no, what I said actually is an alternative interpretation, alternative statement or proposition Q, where Q represents something more non-risky. Like, I would prefer the option of paying the fine on the spot using my credit card and mobile terminal. Especially that version with the mobile terminal has become even more plausible lately after we have mobile card, credit card and mobile terminals all around. I think when Pinker and Lee introduced the case, it was still not widespread to have that option, but it seems the plausibility is to a point context sensitive. So with the availability of the mobile terminals and cards, it's become, some of our utterances have become even more plausible in some concept of plausibility. Okay, what I've done so far is I introduce plausibility provided by certain linguistic devices, as a phenomenon that allows us to mitigate the risks of our communicating messages. And it does that on a general picture by enabling the speakers to plausibly deny the communication of a risky message when challenged. So in the case of the car driver, you might want to try to mitigate the risk of being punished or paying a fine for bribing a police officer. You might go to this more non-risky position. Plausibility lately has been done a lot, and the other paper that I've been writing is actually the politics domain, where politicians try to avoid the risk of losing voters or voters' confidence by using language with plausible ability, because most of the politicians do not want to lose the voters because, for example, they are being perceived as racist, sexist, misogynist, or so on, when they use certain expressions. So, for some politicians, at least,
Not to that.
Sorry?
Not to that.
He can plausibly, yeah, that's it.
You can impossibly deny.
Yeah. So it seems that some of our linguistic expressions are more tuned to be plausible and deniable than some others. So dog whistles, fig leaves, and generics, all of the ones that Trump has used, but also other politicians, offer a certain degree of plausible ability that helps them to save the votes, or depending what their aim is. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go in a bit and say that there are two horns or theses about human language vulnerability when we speak about language. So the one that has been fairly outlined and defended is the so-called, what I call the epistemic horn, where the knowledge of agents spying is very important. So within this epistemic horn, we have two types of people who care about whether something is plausible and deniable or not is going to depend on the knowledge of audience's knowledge of speaker spying or their non-knowledge. So for example, Fricker, Pete, Camp, they are in the camp of saying that an agent, in our case speaker, maintains deniability with respect to their act of spying, namely bribing, for example. We go back to the car example, only when others are unable to know that that speaker fied, or that speaker also asserted a position that was risky, namely the bribing. And we also have within this epistemic horn people like Dinges and Zaku who mean that an agent as our speaker can maintain deniability with respect to their act of spying, even when these with respect to whom they maintain their ability are in a position to know that S five, at least until the denial is crucially actually produced. So Pete, Fricker, and Camp are in a camp where believe that from start on, when you say language with plausible ability, your audience is not in a position to know that you fight, and that's what gives you basically the plausible ability. Dinges and Zako, they believe that you are in a position as an audience to know what the speaker has fight until you are challenged and you deny that. When you deny that, no, I didn't mean to say I want to bribe you, but I meant to pay on the spot with my card, then, according to Dinges and Zako, then you as an audience are no longer in a position to know what the speaker has fight. There are two different views within the epistemic horn. What is important for our purposes today is to notice that both of these epistemic theses are supposed to be compatible with linguistic plausibility, so plausibility that happens in language, but also plausibility that happens in cryptography, computer science, and so on. Another two things that will be important for our talk, and especially to compare it with the LLMs, is the features that the epistemic horn has as necessary is that it's audience dependent and speaker dependent. So whether your speech is plausibly deniable or not will depend on the epistemic position your audience is, namely if they can know what you fight or cannot know what you fight. And the details will be different. As I said, people think that you as an audience are never in a position to know what the speaker find, and that's what puts you in a situation. Ding and Suzaku will say not quite the opposite, but they give you a bit more knowledge as an audience about plausible ability than people. It's also speaker dependence of this thesis that is important. For example, Ding and Suzaku believe that speakers' trustworthiness increases in ability. That means that if you're the speaker if you're challenged and try to deny what you meant, the more trustworthy you are as a speaker, the more plausible deniable is the thing that you're trying to deny. For example, people think that you as a speaker do not achieve any more deniability at the time of the utterance. If anything, that you're trustworthy can generate it more easily, but the plausible ability has been there all along. Okay, let's move to the linguistic core, the one I'm introducing for initially not the purposes is LLMs, but I think that one also squares better with LLMs, is the linguistic core. So then I invite us to think that certain portion of our language can provide speakers with plausible ability based solely on linguistic grounds, no epistemic grounds. Solely on linguistic grounds, regardless of which the subsisting state, knowledge or not, or if end state at all, the speaker or the audience is regarded to plausible ability of such language. So language is plausibly deniable based on linguistic, perhaps also meta-linguistic facts. Then maybe we have a meta-linguistic horn, but I'll stick with the linguistic facts. So it is speaker and audience independent. There's linguistic basis for plausible ability, and it makes plausible ability grounded in these linguistic facts. No psychological, no epistemic ones needed. What these linguistic facts will be, I'm pretty much open at this point. They may include not only semantic or pragmatic facts, might be also phonetics, morphology, syntax, writing systems, and other linguistic facts that might help contributing to certain language being plausible deniable. What's important to see here when we compare to epistemic horn is that the epistemic horn itself does not exclude the role of linguistic facts. They will also say linguistic facts are important when we talk about linguistic plausible deniability. They might even think that linguistic facts are necessary ingredients to have plausible deniability, but they mean that they are not sufficient. So there's also audience's knowledge and speakers' intentions that are important for the epistemic horn. According to the linguistic horn or the strong thesis, where I think that language is doing all the heavy plausible deniability lifting, it is not the act of speaker's denial that makes linguistic-based LPD any more plausible deniable. It's rather that linguistic-based LPD, so the language that includes plausible deniability, makes the speaker's act of denial plausible deniable. It is also true that when speaker uses or utilizes language that is plausible deniable, that can put the audience in certain doxastic state of belief or not belief what the speaker is claiming. But this kind of doxastic state is not relevant for language being plausible deniable or not. It's going to be maybe relevant for strategies the speaker can utilize later, but not for whether language itself is plausible deniable or not. So the grounds for speaker plausible denial are solely linguistic. How much time do I have? I have no idea whether I'm rushing through or.
I have no idea whether you're rushing through, but you started at 35, so you had 20 minutes.
Okay, that sounds doable.
Another 20 minutes.
I tried to fit myself. Yeah, good. So while on the epistemic horn, language with plausible deniability takes audience's knowledge about finding to be relevant for making some speech plausibly deniable. In case of linguistic-based or the strong horn that I'm introducing, speakers only utilize the language that is already plausibly deniable. In contrast to Pete, speaker's denial does not generate deniability. She does not need to convince the audience that, for example, the proposed reinterpretation has been originally intended in order to achieve plausibility. Nor does she need to raise to salience the fact that this interpretation always has been epistemic. So for the epistemic court, it is very important to show that audiences plays vital role for the language being plausible and deniable. If the strong thesis hold, on the other hand, there is no need for generation or reinterpretation to achieve linguistic-based LPD, though this may be the case to achieve the epistemic-based one. As I mentioned earlier, in some cases it might be strategic for you as a speaker to argue and try to convince your audience that the speech you use has linguistic-based plausibility and has been plausible deniable from the start. Whether you're going to be successful or not is going to be dependent on your defensive strategy. We can talk about later. I decided not to talk much about that, but it can be a gap between your use of language with plausibility versus your audience's doxastic state about your language with plausibility, and then it's gonna differ. So while the epistemic layer may be intertwined with linguistic one, it is not constitutive of linguistic one. So epistemic one might include linguistic one, but not the other way around, if the strong thesis. So here's one common dilemma, no matter whether you're for epistemic or the linguistic core of linguistic plausible deniability. So any speech that you as an audience believe is plausible deniable. So someone produces some speech and you think, okay, there is possible that it is plausible deniable when Trump speaks, even though you don't like what he speaks, but it's a kind of language, sometimes dog whistles or fig leaves that might be plausible deniable. Or if you are a police driver, police officer, and you hear that language can be taken care of on the spot, you might believe you are not sure what's going on, but for any speech where the audience is in certain doxastic state about it, such speech is either risky, namely it's a act of bribe, racism, misogyny, so on, but not de facto plausible deniable, in case it lacks linguistic or epistemic-based LPD. Or it is de facto plausibly deniable, in case the speech you use has this linguistic-based or epistemic-based LPD, but it's not de facto risky. It's not a bribe, case of sexism, misogyny, and so on. Okay, to put that more in a more maybe understandable terms. So when you have language with plausible deniability present in certain expressions such as dog whistle, inner cities, and if it can make the speech de facto on linguistic or epistemic grounds, or perhaps on both grounds, non-risky, and those who believe that dog whistle inner cities is racist are mistaken. That's one kind of paradoxical point of this. So both the epistemic chord and the linguistic chord will render language with plausible deniability to not be conveying the risky message, not being a bribe or not being racist or sexist or so on. So consequently, on both horns, epistemic and linguistic, it is plausible to argue that a politician such as Trump is not being racist, sexist, misogynist, or politically manipulative, at least not when he is using language with plausible deniability. So this is a consequence that a lot of us don't wanna have, but it is a consequence that is both on epistemic and linguistic chord, no matter whether you prefer my chord or epistemic chord. However, the part I will not be talking about is that even though the language that Trump uses when he uses language with plausible deniability might not be racist or misogynist or not be sexist, that kind of language can still have effects that can lead to certain harms, especially when the audience takes those speeches to be racist and then create certain behavior that can give grounds for restriction. So the restriction part of language with plausible deniability, if any, is gonna not come because the speaker is a racist or bribing, but because of some bad effects that the audience gonna take often. So hate speech, violence, contribution to certain kind of social, moral or political, creating a society which social, moral, and politically is not desirable. What I'm also be presenting is that I tried to put together a utilitarian approach for restricting some speech with plausible ability. We can talk about that in Q&A if you're interested in that. The point is, even though it turns on both horns, that Trump and others who are using plausibility, if plausibility can save them from being racist, sexist, misogynist, and so on, it doesn't mean that they should keep using that speech. But that is not because of epistemic or linguistic grounds, but on moral grounds. Yeah, I think I'm gonna hop over this resolution part. This is different kind of the static state, what the audience can be in belief or disbelief about speech, and even what your speech is, if it's linguistically or epistemically plausible and viable. That it's gonna happen different stuff. For example, if you have an audience that believe that your speech is already plausible and viable, but there is no linguistic or epistemic grounds for plausibility, so it seems as your speech is plausible and viable, but there is no actual linguistic plausibility, then speech will not necessarily be believed to be having pernicious connotations, while the fact of being racist, misogynist, or a bribe. Okay, I'm coming to the bridge, which is, I guess, in some sense, like I said, the most central part and the most sketchy part of this talk. It's trying to bridge, make a bridge from human language to LLMs. Here, I'm open for all kinds of ingredients to put on in the slide after this one. So we have this old question about the nature of natural or human language, depends what you want to call it, and the newish question, relatively newish question about the nature of LLMs, right? So I think hope is not that, at this moment, at least how LLMs are, it is not very controversial, at least that LLMs are tools that process and generate natural language. The question is what the natural language is, right? So the output that LLMs give, the question is whether it's a surface or a deep level natural language, and what kind of agency they have, if any, instrumental or genuine. So what I'm gonna do now is trying to just think about some ingredients. I'm not proposing what surface level or deep level is supposed to be, but there are some ingredients here that will be relevant for seeing which of the theses, epistemic or linguistic one, will score better with respect to unified account of plausible deniability in language and LLMs. Again, I hope it's not that controversial to say that on a surface level natural language, then we think about language by structure and role in interaction. So regardless of the origin, human or not human, or how you acquire that language. So we talk about syntax, morphology, well-formed semantic structure that has conditionality, entailment, and so on. Talking about semantics, but not kind of the speaker semantics. We are talking more about some kind of linguistic or formal semantics or derived semantics. We might also talk about at the surface level some pragmatic effects, some context sensitivity that might be achieved on surface level in literature, taken not by speakers but by users, but not intention usually. And if we define natural language at a surface level as such, then most of us will say that LLMs plausibly qualify as generating natural language at the surface level. No matter whether the process is natural or not, we'll most likely say that the process is natural. And the fact that the process is artificial, how they do it, does not make English, Norwegian, or Croatian that LLM spits out an artificial language. It's still natural on the surface level for this position. But when we think about natural language at a deep level, this deep structure level, then usually we think a language acquired and used by agents who understand and mean. That's definition that you can play around with, but just for the purposes of this. But it's gonna be enough that deep level requires intentions and agency. So when we think about deep level natural language, we usually think about some kind of strong semantics. We think about intentional intrinsic representation, so psychologist approaches to meaning and content. We will think about also speaker side pragmatics to be relevant, intentions, linkage for competence. That will also be especially important if you want to translate the epistemic form to LLMs. Perhaps grounding reference, deep level also most likely include beliefs, commitments, understanding. perhaps communicative goals and action, maybe social and embodied participation is also important for AI to achieve deep level. Most likely, I think Andy would mean that this is something that is required, right? And again, if we take that to mean some of these ingredients to mean to be the deep level, then at this point, there is where LLMs fail. They don't have deep level natural language. So they do not acquire and use language the way humans do. They generate, as we think we know, that they generate text by statistical pattern recognition. Even we don't know how they're doing, but we know the some part. Okay, when we look at the agency, distinguish between two senses of agency, which will be then again relevant for the very last part that I'm getting at right now. We can talk about functional or instrumental agency, so just some kind of goal-directed behavior, decision-making, according to the rules or preferences that have already been put in the system and acting in the environment to achieve certain outcomes. That's the kind of level agency that LLMs can plausibly qualify, or chatbots and similar. But this one does not presuppose any kind of strong AI, nor deep level natural language sense that I just talked about. On the other hand, another distinction or sense of agency we often operate with is the genuine agency. And now genuine in what sense can be intentional at the epistemic level or maybe even moral level agency. Some might think that you need to have intentional to be able to have epistemic level, and if you have these both, you are probably necessary to be able to have a moral agency. But in any case, I believe it's fairly uncontroversial that to have a genuine agency, at least intentional epistemic one, the agent needs to have some kind of mental state, intentions, and semantic understanding in a deeper way as a deep level natural language conception requires. It also most likely needs to have understanding, commitments, and responses to reason, especially for the epistemic agency, and for the moral one, probably moral and legal responsibility to accountability, maybe even consciousness and free will. These are things that are still related. But no matter what all of these ingredients mean that a deep level or genuine agency is, there is where LLMs at the moment fail. Okay. Now onto the final part, is try to piece together the linguistic form, the epistemic form, and these two distinguishing between senses of agency and natural language. So what we're trying to do now here is taking some, again, hopefully not too controversial assumptions that current LLMs have at least achieved instrumental level of agency, and LLMs can generate surface level natural language plausible ability. So if we try to move from the natural language plausible ability to LLMs, so think of the cases where LLMs generate from scratch, if you want to call it like that. So when LLMs spits out new not learned instances of generics. So let's say the data that's been training has never included some kind of generic, assuming generics language with plausible ability, like Croats are such and such, sometimes stereotypes, Norwegians are such and such, Ukrainians are such and such, and so on. So creating from scratch, maybe not the type of plausible linguistic plausible ability, but at least the token of plausible ability. Then you might say the LLMs generate from scratch. Or another way, or another thing that they can do is to generate instance of use or transmit parts of linguistic expression they've been trained on. So I don't think it's that implausible. I haven't tried, but I think if I asked it, or I will most likely, unless the system has prevented it from doing, in some replies, LLMs might also use inner cities as a dog whistle, as an instance of plausible ability. So LLMs can also generate, or in a sense of transmit, language with plausible ability that comes from human natural language. So these are the two ways that LLMs either generate or generate. There might be more ways of how they generate language with plausible ability, but these are two ways that are at least look very similar to the language with plausible ability we have in the human language. So what I'm gonna do in the rest of this talk, where I have maybe 10 minutes.
5 minutes.
Fine, okay, that will have to be. I think I have 3-4 slides left. So I'm gonna try now to do some kind of evaluation. So which thesis, epistemic or linguistic one, squares better in the context of large language models with plausible ability? And is a unified account of the interpretation of human language and LLMs utterances with plausible ability possible? Okay, so if we look at the epistemic horn that I explained for the human language plausible ability, in general, that kind of horn, that thesis seems more demanding than the linguistic one. It's very much audience and speaker dependent. When we look at the LLMs specifically, it seems that the epistemic horn that's been developed for human language requires something that LLMs do not have, namely deep level natural language. So LLMs would have to have intentions to fly. If we go by Pete and Camp and others, if we want to translate their account to LLMs, then LLMs have to have intentions to fly. It doesn't seem that they have intentions to fly. They will also need to be genuine epistemic agents. Possibly they will need to be part of stronger agency. But at the moment, it doesn't seem that the audience has a knowledge or doesn't have a knowledge about what an agent, namely LLM, has five, because LLM is not at the moment agent in this relevant sense, in the deep or genuine thing. So it fails both with this deep level NL and genuine agency. So consequences were on a very, very generic level. It seems that the epistemic horn that's been well developed for language, human language, it's not best suited for a unified account between human language plausible ability and LLMs with plausible ability, if that's our project, right? Another consequence is that if epistemic horn holds for human language with plausible ability, then LLMs do not generate plausible ability. That's also one big consequence that I'm happy to talk about more in Q&A. Okay, let's now do the linguistic horn. How the linguistic horn, if we try to translate and extend it to the LLMs with plausible ability. This one seems to be simpler than epistemic horn in general, so it's not audience and speaker dependent. But when we look to LLMs more specifically, it seems that the linguistic horn requires something that LLMs already have. It will be okay with LLMs only having surface level natural language. So there's no need, according to the linguistic horn, for LLMs to have intentions to fly. There's no need for audience to interpret or know that meaning of what the speakers have fired. It is also okay on a decent amount of linguistic horn, not all possible theoretic linguistic horns. Horn will also be okay with just having LLMs having instrumental agency, namely the weak AI. So on linguistic horn, on not all accounts possible, but quite a lot of accounts on linguistic horn, there will not be no need for LLMs to be epistemic agents, or no direct dependence on audience, or a lack of knowledge about what the agents, namely LLMs, are doing. Because here the agents is the deep agency or the genuine agency. Linguistic horn, as it's formulated, does not require that. Some quick consequences. It seems that if we try to translate or extend the linguistic horn about human language plausible ability, it opens for a unified account of human and LLMs with plausible ability. Some qualifications, yeah, it will open door for quite a few, depends. We can go in detail a little. Depends what the linguistic facts you will take that are grounding for plausible ability. But it opens quite a lot of for quite a lot of theories of semantics. This opens a door for a unified account between LLMs and human linguistic plausible ability. A further consequence is that if linguistic horn holds that I developed for a human language, then one consequence is that LLMs do generate plausible. Yeah, I think this is I just quickly read this out and then I'm done. So if we look at this dilemma we had for the epistemic and linguistic horn, and here if we scratch the epistemic-based language with vulnerability because LLMs, it doesn't seem to that it works. So then we might say that any LLM's output that is believed by the audience to be plausible deniable. So when you read certain texts, inner cities, for example, that LLMs might spit out, it opens a dilemma. Well, alternate now, I'm trying to be very careful. That message, that output is either risky, in this case racist if it's inner city, but not de facto plausible deniable, so there is no linguistic basis for it, or it's de facto plausible deniable, if there is a linguistic-based plausibility. I scratched the epistemic ones because it's not compatible much with the LLMs, but not de facto risky, racist, sexist, misogynist, or manipulative. So in other words, it is plausible to argue that LLMs, the neither LLMs or their output are being racist, sexist, misogynist, and so on, at least not when LLMs output language with linguistic-based language with LLMs with plausible deniability. However, again, another peril for the possibility of restricting LLMs with plausible deniability, we might do the same move. The effects of LLMs might still lead to harms. So the audience reading inner cities, it might create some stereotypes, biases, and so on, that might produce kind of behavior that might give grounds on moral basis grounds for restriction of such kind of speech.